Thank you. Hello. See you. So, yeah, I would like to speak somewhat shortly, maybe for a half hour, and then we can have more discussion, and then we can go out and have more discussion. So, I came to speak here about radical abolitionism, by any means necessary. And what I think we should be talking about is question of tactics in the movement, of course, the diversity of tactics, and what tactics are most effective, and how we can become a true force of resistance on this planet, because what we need ultimately is not a single issue movement, which is what the animal rights movement has largely been limited to. But we need to have groups working together in resistance against large structures of oppression. And so we have set the bar so low for this movement. We need to figure out how we can have a broader social impact and influence in society, because we're not very big, and we're not understood, and we are not often respected. And that's partly or largely our own fault, because of the flaws of the vegan and animal advocacy movements. So if we're talking about abolitionism, we're talking about slavery. And I want to begin by saying some remarks about slavery. Because when we talk about contemporary animal rights as an abolitionist movement, this is sometimes called the new abolitionist movement, or the new abolitionism. And that means it is an explicit reference to the abolitionist movements in the 19th century against human slavery. And there was one in England that went fairly smoothly, largely through legal change. And then there was one in the United States that was much longer, more difficult, violent, and protracted battle. And that is the movement I want to focus on when I talk about the first stage of an abolitionist movement, because I think there's so much to be learned by how the battle was fought in the United States during the 19th century. And that people who call themselves abolitionists really know very little about 19th century abolitionist history. There have been abolitionist movements against slavery, of course, everywhere and in other European countries in the 19th century, but the two best-known cases are in Great Britain and the United States. The United States was the most violent and dramatic of the struggles, so there's a lot to be learned from that. The slavery did not begin with humans. Slavery began with animals. Animals were the first slaves, first victims of slavery, and this began 10,000 years ago with the emergence of agricultural society and domestication. The domestication of plants and animals is how we define agricultural society. And that's a nice euphemism, isn't it? It's a nice way to put it, domesticating animals. Like we're bringing them into our homes and sharing our lives with them. But the domestication of animals 10,000 years ago began with breaking the wild spirit. Began with eliminating any resistance that they offered. It began with confining them with ropes and with cages and various technologies, ultimately castrating them, branding them, cropping them, all the various things that we do to make animals manageable slaves for human purposes. So what we call civilization begins with agricultural society, and agricultural society begins with domestication, and the most important part of that system was animal slavery. So animals were the first slaves. They have been enslaved the longest of any beings, and they have been enslaved in the most vicious and violent ways. It's hard to play the game of comparing which group suffered more than others. I'm not really interested in quantifying the suffering involved in African American slavery or the Holocaust in Germany or animal slavery, but it really does have to be appreciated that we're talking about the most intense and the greatest system of slavery and killing ever. We're not talking about millions, we're talking about billions. We're not talking about a period of a few decades or a few centuries. We're talking about a 10,000-year legacy. And we are not just talking about confinement and beatings. We are talking about ripping animals apart piece by piece while they're still alive in a way. So this system of slavery has been the backbone of civilization. It's like every civilization that we have known is a class civilization, and classes are built upon slavery. Marx said that there is no wealth without poverty. There is no elite class without an oppressed class. It's what you call a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game is when one group wins only if another group loses. And that's what class society is, that you only have an upper class if you have a lower class. You only have people who are wealthy if you have people who are poor. Because where does wealth come from? It's stolen from the poor. Sometimes literally, you take people's resources and land and you enslave them, but also through labor that's unpaid. You exploit them, you give them the bare necessities to survive, and they produce so much value for you, so many commodities, so many things that you can sell for profit. So the systems of wealth and poverty are interconnected. And that not only is the name of the game in capitalism, but throughout civilization. So history has always been a struggle between the winners and losers, the victimizers and the victims. And animals have been the greatest victims of the most intense systems of confinement, control, torture, and murder. Divisible. Divisible by this demented evolutionary baggage that we have, we call a forebrain, that possibly genetically flawed. Certainly we have no idea how to wield powerful technologies in a non-violent, non-oppressive way. So human slavery actually began where animal slavery began, and there's a reason for that. Because animals taught us how to enslave and what kind of beings we could enslave. So it's no coincidence that the first forms of human slavery can be found back in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago in ancient Sumer, one of the first cities to ever arrive. And already there was the animal domestication. Domesticating animals showed a patriarchal society how to domesticate women, how to domesticate human slaves, how to castrate them, how to breed them, how to use them for labor purposes. So this is all first done on animals, and you find the first systems of patriarchy and human slavery in the very centers of the civilization where agricultural society emerged. Quite interestingly, agricultural society emerged simultaneously in 4 or 5 different places around what's called the Fertile Crescent. For instance, Baghdad, Iraq, the U.S. bombed the hell out of, was one of the earliest centers of this new civilized world. So that was the area in which civilization and agricultural society evolved. By the 15th century, we had the international slave trade. And this began first with a guy called Henry the Navigator in the middle of the 15th century, 1450s or so. And he was a Dutch colonialist, and he went to Africa to steal people from their families and communities and bring them back in chains and enslaved. Of course, Christopher Columbus, who went off on a voyage, he didn't even know where he was going. He got lost and ended up in some islands and areas in which some beautiful tribal people lived. The Arawak Indians were one people, and if you can imagine this site where they see these incredible, massive ships coming, and these people dressed in steel and armor, the awe that they felt, and the awe that the Europeans felt for these natives that they were encountering for the first time, because navigation was very primitive. People weren't sure if they were going to go off the edge of the earth or not, let alone what kind of peoples existed throughout the world. So the Europeans were equally impressed by these Indian people. They were strong, and they wore colored, if you will, costumes or dress, and they were strong and dark-skinned, and they were very impressed by the integrity and health and vitality of these people. So Columbus is writing in his journal, and he is describing these people in very positive, noble, impressive terms, and then he says how easy they will be to exploit. So that's the colonial mind, and that's why we have a problem celebrating Columbus Day in the United States, which is a national holiday, because he was a genocidal maniac. And he made many trips, and they stole people, and pretty soon the transatlantic slave trade came out of Africa, and millions of people were taken from Africa to the United States. Now, many people, for instance, went to Brazil or other islands or some parts of Europe. The worst place to go if you were a slave, being stolen from your home in Africa, being forced to walk maybe hundreds of miles to the shore, and then to get on a boat that was just jam-packed with people who were dying, and you could be chained next to a dead person, and they might just throw you overboard if you were sick. Completely disposable, and millions of people were brought to the United States this way, and then they just started breeding slaves. But the United States was the worst place to be, to end up as a slave, because the system was the most brutal system anywhere on the planet at that time. Particularly the southern plantations that were organized for the production of cotton and sugar cane, and etc. So the African American slaves became a very important part of the American economy, and that was the bottom line. So we fought a revolutionary war in the name of freedom as we enslaved millions of African Americans. They eventually participated in this war against the British, and we rewarded them by perpetuating their enslavement. So a civil war, of course, was fought in the U.S. in the 19th century, and it ended in 1965. And the reason why it ended was not because of moral protest, but because of technological and economic changes in the mode of production. Marx got this right when he said, slavery ended in the United States because the mode of production changed. The southern plantation system was outmoded, and labor and production shifted toward the north with automated machinery. Okay, so that everyone can become a slave. Not just the blacks, everyone got the right to be a slave through the wage labor system. But until 1965, of course, there were various movements against slavery. The Quakers and various religious communities protested this. A group of people called themselves abolitionists in the early 19th century, but they weren't very strong. A second group, or a second wave of abolitionists emerged in 1830 and fought all the way until the end of the war in 1865 with the emancipation, the constitutional emancipation of African Americans. And they were called abolitionists. Sometimes they're called immediatists because their demands were very intense. They said, we are not interested in slow change. We are not going to accept reform. We want this entire vast system of slavery broken, dismantled, ripped apart completely. We want it not regulated, but abolished. And so that's the definition of abolitionism when we're talking about human slavery or animal slavery. It's not a welfare system where you treat the slave kindly. There's no way to treat the slave kindly except to free the slave. It's not a system in which you regulate the institutions of domination. It's a system, or it's a politics in which you eliminate the institutions of domination. And there is no compromise, no collaboration, no deals, no contracts. It's win it all or lose it all. So in 1830, this new, more militant group of abolitionists emerged in the United States, and they're a very diverse group of people. Understand, they were a small minority of the population. And when you think as an animal rights activist today, or as an abolitionist, if you are today, that you consider yourself a minority even within the animal movement, and people consider you radical and extreme, that's exactly how these people were considered during 1830s in the United States. A lot of people were opposed to slavery, but the abolitionists were the most radical. And there were a small minority of people. Most people considered them too extreme, too violent, and not really credible. But they were the ones that were really driving the change. Of course, there was a whole civil war being fought, driving change too, but the Civil War was not about slavery, it was about bringing the Union together, bringing the country together, and slavery was a divisive issue. So if we could end the question of slavery, we could bring the Union together. President Lincoln didn't give a damn about black slaves. He thought the best solution was to get rid of them to Africa. If you read some of his statements, quite racist. He felt they were inferior to white people. So the abolitionists played a huge role in driving change in the United States. Now I said they were very diverse. They included whites and they included blacks. One of the most famous abolitionists was William Lloyd Garrison, a white guy. William Lloyd Garrison was about the most radical of them all. William Lloyd Garrison said that the Constitution is inherently a slave document. He burned it in public one day. Oh, a very radical thing to do in the 19th century. Like the students in the 60s would burn their draft cards. He burned the Constitution. And, he was not a very popular figure. One day he was almost killed. Gangs of people dragged him to a rooftop, and somehow some restraint was found, and he was not thrown to his death. He was beaten badly. He was widely reviled as an extremist or a race traitor. And because he, like most of the abolitionists, worked in the North, the Southern racist always said, "Why don't you come down here and speak?" Well, we know why, because you are some very violent people, and we are going to change your system and dismantle it. And you had one of his pupils, actually, someone he helped to bring along, was named Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, you may know, because he was a self-taught slave. And he said things that the only thing that power understands is power. And you can't have thunder without lightning. You can't have change without violent opposition to it. And so he was a black slave, former slave, self-taught. He liberated himself up to the north and worked as a northern abolitionist. And he was so articulate that people didn't believe he was a slave. So you know what he did? He'd take off his jacket like this and he'd show his back. And you could see 5 dimensions of scars across his back from being whipped. And there are many articulate black slaves who were abolitionists. Sojourner Youth was a woman who was well known in the speaking circuit. You had people like Harriet Tubman, who was a black slave who freed herself and then freed her family, her friends, and anyone that wanted to take the chance. She ran the Underground Railroad, and which was a system of houses that people could receive support going all the way up to the north and sometimes into Canada. She was the expert guide. They call her the conductor of the Underground Railroad. And in fact, she was so skilled, if you can imagine, moving through this vast territory, this huge continent, under conditions in which you could easily be captured and killed. She was breaking the law. And sometimes people who aided the emancipation of slaves, they were not treated very kindly. She did this dozens of times, and the U.S. Army used her as a scout to penetrate into southern territories during the latter part of the Civil War. She was part of the abolitionist movement. There are many writers and orators, some white, some black, and either they were explicitly violent, like David Walker said, we will wade through a river of blood to get to our freedom. And he advocated violence, or their rhetoric. William Garrison was nonviolent. Their rhetoric was often very violent and fiery in its tone and metaphors. You don't find that kind of rhetoric in the animal rights movement today because pacifism has pretty much taken the teeth and claws out of our power. And so people are all concerned about the niceties of speech, but these people wrote some very powerful speeches. And you see, their role was to be an agitator. They worked in the North. Of course, Harriet Tubman was in the South, but the orators were agitators. They would try to stir people up. People often say to me, for instance, "Oh, well, why don't you do animal liberation yourself? You just all talk. You want other people to do it because you're afraid." Not afraid. I'm just not stupid. Number one, I'm in the above ground. It's pretty hard to work in the underground and the above ground at the same time. And number two, I consider myself an agitator. I'm not so young anymore. I don't climb fences so well, and not very handy with electrical circuitry. So, I see myself as playing the role of the agitator to help spark change, to help raise the bar, right? To elevate the fight to a higher level. And you had people like Nat Turner and John Brown. The first was black, the second was white, who led violent revolts. Nat Turner killed 50 whites in one night. He was captured and executed. John Brown led a failed armed insurrection against the U.S. Army, captured and hung, but became a hero ever since. Many folk songs have been written about John Brown. So what I want to emphasize about this movement that we can learn from is take heart in the fact that it was a minority movement and it was not popular, but they were very effective in driving change. Take note that they did not compromise. They did not collaborate. They asked for one thing and nothing else, complete and total abolition of slavery, which eventually happened. That didn't mean black people were free. That didn't mean that other roles weren't played, but they played a very important role in that. And this was a very pluralistic movement. Not all, again, of the abolitionists were violent. William Lloyd Garrison was against violence, but Nat Turner obviously was not. Some people insisted we work through legal means. Harriet Tubman thought we should immediately emancipate slaves through the Underground Railroad. What I'm insisting on is there was a diversity of tactics. And in our movement, we have some people who are only comfortable working legally, and that's fine. And we have people who are working illegally, and I think they're doing the most effective work. We have people who are nonviolent, and we have people who, if they don't advocate violence, will defend it. I don't advocate violence. I think it's fully justifiable as a tactic. We can talk about that. So it was a diverse movement, and you see, in our movement, it gets handicapped, if you will, by this dogma of pacifism, which is almost universal, and it's in all movements. And our heroes are Gandhi and King, and whatever they say is like biblical truth. The only way they won their struggles was through nonviolence. First of all, they didn't win anything. Second of all, there were many forces working behind King and behind Gandhi that were a little more militant, that were part of the winds of change at that time. And we have an above-ground element to the animal advocacy movement that insists on demonizing the underground. These are our people. These are our warriors. You don't denounce soldiers on your side fighting on the front lines. If you can't fight on the front lines, well then you make food and you make preparations and you support them. During the Second World War, not everybody fought in that war. Okay, most women didn't, but they were helping in the way that they could. They were contributing food and supplies, and they were involved in supporting the frontline soldiers. So the underground movement is a bit like our front line, and they should be supported. And if our movement can't at least support them, like political prisoners, you support them, you write them letters, you give them money. The liberation movement, you defend it. You at least shut up if you don't like it. So, because you're speaking the language of the FBI and the state when you say, this is a criminal element, these are terrorists, and they give our movement a bad name. Well, you idiots. You are the ones who are giving the movement a bad name. You are victims of what I would call the Stockholm Syndrome. You know that, right? Coming from people who are captured by bank robbers and they learn to identify with their oppressors. The Stockholm Syndrome is when people identify with their oppressors rather than with the oppressed. I see so many examples of this in our movement. It's really quite alarming. I'll give you one example. Was a Canadian Francione activist. Francione activist, I'll show you, was a contradiction in terms. But a Canadian who was commenting on the Paul Watson and the Sea Shepherd campaign. Now, what Paul Watson does is not violent. It involves direct action, putting himself between the hunter and the hunted, and maybe nudging a ship or cutting a ship's hull open. But he never has endangered anyone's life, unlike his life has been endangered many times. So this guy was saying, look, the Sea Shepherd, this group, they're violent, they're thugs, they're terrorists, they give us a bad name. We should understand the humanity of the sealers. What? The humanity of the sealers? If you read Paul Watson's books, he'll describe passages where he confronts sealers, and they take a baby seal and they strip its skin off right in front of you, and they laugh. These fuckers have no humanity. They should have no mercy or compassion. They should be eliminated by any means necessary. So don't talk to me about the humanity of the sealers while you're criminalizing the people who are really fighting on the front lines. Obviously there's something wrong with you. You have internalized the superego of the state. You have somehow gotten your priorities upside down, so you have more sympathy for the oppressors than the oppressed. I can give you a dozen examples of the Stockholm Syndrome as it operates in our movement, but it is a factor in our movement, and it is a dominant psychology. It's easy to diagnose, and it should always be challenged. So the abolitionist movement of the 19th century was diverse, it was effective. And even though some people didn't agree with violence, they didn't criticize those who were doing it. There was a united front to end slavery, and that was it. So we can learn a lot from these tactics. Now, in terms of the animal movement, so an abolitionist movement emerged. When did it emerge? There's various ways we could date this. Did you know that in the 19th century, the hard line of the anti-vivisection movement in the U.S. were women? They were feminists, anti-vivisectionists, abolitionists. They held the abolitionists in the 19th century in the animal movement. The rest were welfare. And they took a hard line, and they were unfortunately easily crushed by the vivisection industry that denounced them as sentimental, womanish, and we're doing rational science here for the good of humanity, and these sentimental fools are impeding medical progress. That's a really easy charge to make stick. And they play that almost always successfully. Anti-progress, anti-medical advance. And here, because they were women, they could also say they were sentimental and foolish. So by the way, in the 19th century, there was a category called zoophilia, which doesn't mean that you had some, bestiality impulse. It meant that you had an abnormal love and compassion for animals. So you loved animals more than humans. And if you loved animals at all, there was something wrong with you. Your sympathy should be with humans, not animals. And they call that zoophilia. So we had an abolitionist anti-vivisection movement in the U.S., mainly sticking to that history, or England, in the 19th century. By 1976, the Animal Liberation Front had emerged in England. And sometimes people say they have welfare tactics, sometimes they talk about suffering of animals, but clearly they were not out to strike bargains with industries, but to destroy the industries with property damage, with insurance costs, with arson, and by taking every captive slave that they could take. And then Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, in 1975 came about. This was obviously this book is misnamed. He was trying to play off of popular language at the time, but for marketing purposes. The book has nothing to do with animal liberation, nothing to do with even animal rights. It's a welfare book. He's utilitarian. He's concerned with the reduction of suffering more than the elimination of the institutions of oppression. Tom Reagan in 1983 wrote a book called The Case for Animal Rights, and that book was the first really solid philosophical analysis for rights, that animals have rights. To understand the relationship between rights and abolition, because if you have rights, your fundamental right is to be free, to have control over your body, and to have the freedom from someone taking your body against your will, someone imposing injury on you against your will, someone killing you against your will. If nothing else, rights protects us from that and gives us freedom to pursue our lives as we choose. So abolitionism implies rights, that we were going to abolish slavery because every slave has a right to live free. This is a long story, I'm not going to go into it, but the concept of rights is a bourgeois concept, comes from capitalist, contractual state relationships. And so some people use the term liberation because they don't want to use the term rights because that's a capitalist discourse, and like anarchists don't like the term rights. But whatever you feel about that, there's something in the concept of rights that's important. You have intrinsic value. That value is never to be overridden, to override, for some alleged social utility. You have a right, and that is it, and no one can violate that right. So abolitionists are people who insist upon the rights of animals, human and non-human, to live freely and not under conditions of slavery. I just want to say something about what a slave is, why animals are slaves, and then I'll say something about abolitionism as it degenerated into a Francione cult that we must overcome, because it's a form of paralysis and it's a symptom of the Stockholm Syndrome. What is a slave? A slave is any being, number one, held captive against his or her will, within conditions of confinement, therefore. Two, that is exploited for his or her labor power, to perform some kind of task for the slave owner. So, third, a slave is a being held in confinement, forced to perform labor for the owner. And therefore, third, a slave is a being who is merely or treated as a commodity, an object, a resource, or property. Not a living being, not a subject, but a thing. Legally defined as such and treated as such. So, obviously slaves fit this definition. If you look, for instance, at circuses or aquariums, you have an elephant that is shipped in conditions of confinement, held in chains when it's not performing, from city to city, living in trucks or living under shade at best, in chains when not performing, has to perform 3-4 times a day. Same thing with circus tigers, same things with orcas or whales in aquariums. They're forced to perform throughout the day. They are forced to labor. They are held captive. They are working for someone else. They get no pay or benefits. They're simply slaves. The law protects them as such. The law defines them as objects, not subjects. If you look at factory farm animals, of course, they're held in conditions of confinement. What do they produce? What kind of labor do they produce? They produce their bodies. They produce milk, eggs, flesh. And in order to help produce that, they're fed all kinds of chemicals. They might be genetically modified. They certainly are not rewarded for their labor. Their labor is for their owners. Their owners have every legal right over them as property to do with them as they will. So factory farm animals are slaves. What they produce is their body. Vivisection animals are slaves. They're held in captivity. They're forced to labor, to produce. To produce what? You might ask in the case of vivisection. Data. They produce data. You inject them with drugs, you smash their heads open, you do any invasive procedure you so desire. It's all legal. As long as you maybe give them proper cage size, you can smash their heads open and break their spines and pump them full of toxic chemicals until they die. And they produce data. They produce data used to make drugs that are rushed through the state regulation procedures, and then are ultimately tested on humans, and in most cases cause injury or death. So animals are slaves in a literal sense of the word. It's controversial to call an animal slave for two reasons. The Marxists don't like this terminology because for Marxists, animals are things. Animals are not subjects. They're different from humans. They lack rationality. They don't have complex lives. I can't liberate, that speaker, the Speaker Liberation Front or the Chair Liberation Front. Makes no sense. So similarly for a typical leftist speciesist, it makes no sense to talk about Animal Liberation Front because animals are not subjects of a life. They are a property and you can't liberate them. And also, slavery is something that applies only to humans, the Marxists would say. They're not the working class, they're not the proletariat, they don't organize themselves, they don't read Lenin and Trotsky or whoever. Oh, that's all true. And they don't organize themselves. But they resist and revolt like other slaves do. No, they're not a working class, but they're an oppressed class, and they are slaves. And the definition I've given, I think, is quite reasonable. They are slaves. I don't give a fuck what Marxists say, they're slaves. More sensitively, African Americans don't like this idea of animal slavery any more than Jewish people typically don't like the term animal holocaust, because they think they lived through this experience. To attribute the term slavery to anyone but them is to somehow diminish their tragic history. And you see, black people have always been likened to animals. That's how they were oppressed. They were called savages or beasts or like animals. There was debates in the 19th century whether black people really were humans or some form of animal. Quasi-scientific debate. So that's why they don't like the PETA exhibit. Compares human slavery to animal slavery, because PETA is not very sensitive to the problems of comparing humans to animals, because humans have been reduced to animals. Well, that means you make your case more sensitively with greater nuance, but it doesn't mean you don't say animals are not slaves. I don't care. They are slaves. It is slavery. Not only people can be enslaved. And the system of slavery with animals, once again, is the worst, longest, and most brutal ever. PETA are clearly trying to regulate and eliminate the institutions of slavery. They are collaborating with capitalists by signing contracts with them, by owning stock in their companies so they have some kind of voice or vote. And they are working with them to create conditions of humane slaughter or humane meat. And that's what the two largest animal advocacy groups in the world are doing. Collaborating with capitalists in a way that furthers the interests of the exploiters, furthers the interests of the mainstream groups, works for everyone's good except for the animals. So there's a lot more I can say about that, and you can see that welfarism is problematic because you are regulating the details of exploitation. The whole system is cruel. It doesn't matter whether there are bigger cages or better treatment of the slaves. It's the system itself of institutionalization that is inherently cruel. And so there's no such thing as a humane treatment of a slave. That it must be abolished, so that the living being can be the free being that it craves to be. So Francione made this critique in a particularly sharp way in a series of books and essays, and emerged in the U.S., also Canada, Australia, some parts of Europe, as like the new guru, the William Lloyd Garrison of the late 20th and early 21st century. As the man with the plan, who had the vision, the critique of welfarism, so that everyone became clear this is a dead end and the only path to achieving our goals is through abolition. Well, there are quite a few problems with this. So I'll just spell these out quickly and suggest that we need to have a much more diverse and effective movement. Because right now Francione is clearly a dead end, and the abolitionist movement, which seems to be on the right track, is very much on the wrong track in countries like the U.S. because of this kind of influence and the symptom of this. As a pacifist, he says, "I'm violently opposed to violence." Okay. And he therefore criticizes the ALF, he criticizes Paul Watson, he criticizes anyone who does any direct action tactics. He has reduced our set of options to absolutely zero. You see, what I want to do is put options on the table, more options. What he has done is clear them all off. What pacifists do is limit our options. We need to expand them. So he's of course opposed to the Animal Liberation Front. That's violent. Really, is it? The Animal Liberation Front doesn't say what it's doing is violent. Where do you get this definition? How is destroying a thing, property, violence? I can imagine how it might be, but I don't accept that definition, and it's controversial. But they don't give you a good counter definition, a good argument for their argument, for their belief that this is violence. Oh, they might quote Gandhi or King. Why don't you quote the Bible too? So what? So therefore they talk in the same language of the state and the FBI and opposing the militant wing of the movement. So, okay, you're opposed to what's called closed rescue or underground liberation. You're opposed to the Animal Liberation Front. Fine. What options you got for us? Well, I'm opposed to open rescues too. Well, the people who do open rescues, like in Spain, consider themselves to be nonviolent. In fact, consider themselves to be something like using Gandhian tactics. They don't work at night, or they don't work with masks. They're completely open and they're not anonymous. They document the conditions that they find. They take out a few animals, a little easier to do with chickens and elephants, and they hold a press conference and say, we did this, here's the documentation. Persecute us. And in most cases, they're not persecuted. Except for breaking a lock, there's no property damage, and these tactics clearly are in the spirit of Gandhi and King. Okay? As you've noticed by pacifists, they quote Gandhi and King in words. They never use their actions or tactics. So, if we had a mass civil disobedience movement in favor of animals led by someone like Martin Luther King instead of Gary Francione, who might have something in a country like the United States? I'll give you an example of two exact quotes from King and from Francione. Okay, again, Francione quotes King as Mr. Nonviolence, and this is the path we should follow. But only in words, because we're afraid of action. So Martin Luther King says, we will fill the jails with singing children. The animal rights movement said, my God, you terrorists, now you want to hurt our children too. You're a child rapist or something. What are you? People are monsters. Right? But, thousands of people went to jail. In fact, some children did go to jail. And that was the idea, to fill the jails with people until the systems just would crack. Francione doesn't say that. Here's a direct quote from Francione. If you can only do one action today, talk to someone in the line at the grocery store and say, are you vegan? Do you know about veganism? Can you imagine anything more pathetic? Can you imagine limiting yourself to such a degree? Can you imagine setting the bar any lower? You can't even trip on it, it's so low, it's in the ground. Can you imagine someone like this having any credibility as a leader? Well, that's what we find with the new abolitionism under Francione's rule. Moreover, what has happened with veganism is a form of abolition, right? So we're not out there trying to, with PETA, trying to say, gas the chickens, don't slice their necks. We're out there with vegan pamphlets, and we're trying to get people to go vegan. If you go vegan, you don't eat meat, and ideally these systems shut down. That's an abolitionist approach. Unfortunately, vegan abolitionism means only pacifism. It means consumerism. It means domestic-bound activity. These are people who stay at home, who are Facebook warriors, who are bloggers, talking to other bloggers. They're not doing any education, so this is what you're left with, vegan education. Okay? What is education? They don't know. What are the, in theory, what is it in practice? They don't know. They don't educate. They only attack and preach to the choir, blog to the choir. So that's why we're less than 1% of the movement, of the population in the U.S. That's why the vegan movement is so small everywhere. It's white, elite, domestic bound. It doesn't use the tactics of the civil rights movement. It certainly has not used any controversial tactics of the abolitionist movement. Sometimes people claim that heritage. We have become so marginalized and so easily controlled by police and the state. We've done it to ourselves. We've done it to ourselves. We have defined animal liberation in strictly domestic lifestyle terms. It's more of a lifestyle movement than a political movement. Let me remind you that when the founder of veganism, Donald Watson, in 1944, when he coined the term veganism, defined it, he said it's not a diet, it's an ethics. It's not just an ethics, however, it's a politics. Veganism is anti-oppression. Against the oppression of animals, non-human animals, and against the oppression of human animals. He was close to what we might call today a politics of total liberation. And ever since then, veganism has been sliding downhill, setting the bar lower and lower, becoming ever more co-opted by capitalist markets and by these gurus, these false leaders. You join the cult, you drink the Kool-Aid, and you make a vow. You make a vow to attack the militants. You make a vow to be pacifist. You know, see, pacifism is in English anyway, it's a bad word because it means being passive. But it didn't mean being passive for Martin Luther King and Gandhi. It meant being active. You're a pacifist in the sense you're nonviolent, but there was pacifist resistance. And both King and Gandhi emphasized action, action, action. And you confront the oppressor, you provoke a fight, you bring it on, and you take the punishment if you need to, you take the jailings if you need to, you come back and you do it again. And you keep hitting, you keep fighting with the power of love. You can overcome hatred, maybe not, but they were an active movement. Today what we call pacifism really literally is passive. We're not active, we're not in the streets, we're not anywhere near the flashpoints of change. The left has no respect for us, rightly so. If you go on in the media UK, or you go on some of the left-wing anarchist sites, and an animal liberation person or vegan is naive enough to post something, read the commentary, because it is vicious, in many ways more stupid than the average person. But basically, we are dismissed as a white, elitist, bourgeois, capitalist consumer movement. And that charge, unfortunately, pretty much sticks to the vegan movement. We don't have people of color in our movement because we don't do real outreach. We don't work with poor, the oppressed, the sick, the needy. We don't leave college campuses to go into the inner cities. We are marginalized by our own choices.